Hello, everyone. Doesn't look like we have an agenda today, which is fine. I guess I'll go ahead and put the little spiel about this meeting will be recorded and posted to YouTube. We follow the CNCF Code of Conduct as a Kubernetes project. Please don't be a jerk. Thanks. Oh, we do have a few. Okay. Custom CNIs. What mechanism are we introducing custom CNIs by?
I added in the when building the node image, you can the manifest. So each CNI has a CNI manifest, and it's preloaded with the same mechanism that you use for the base images. What is the name? So you define a strat with the name of the images, the name of the CNI, and the name of the manifest. And when you build the node images, it installs that CNI. Let me post the commit.
Yeah, I see this. But so the big downside of this is then if I decide that I want IPv6, I need to have built the node image with a different base image.
Yeah, because the problem is that you cannot have one CNI to rule everything. So this is what I found.
Mean, can you? I mean, what about putting multiple manifests in the base image, or?
Yeah, but that's the other option. But then you need to start to add more functions to configure the CNI. So it's the trade-off between adding more code to manage the CNI thing, or
well, you still don't need that, right? So if you have a manifest for each IP mode, you can just select based on the IP mode, right? So like if you have IPv6, you take the IPv6 manifest. If you have IPv4, you take the IPv4 manifest. If somehow you have dual stack, and then you still need code. So I guess my two concerns are, one, we're increasing. So something I've been looking at that's a slightly orthogonal to this, but going to relate. First of all, is just that as we change how we're doing things with the images, we need a better way to keep track of this, so Kine can support it properly. So what I'm looking at is labeling images with some metadata. So we can say like, this image is built with Calico or something like that. Or this image is built with this version of how we decided to handle CNI. And that way that future Kine versions can detect like, oh, this is the second iteration of how we were managing CNIs. I need to work in this mode if I'm going to boot this image. Or at the very least, they can say, this is too old. This image is old. It is built with some old way of doing CNI. I'm not going to boot it. But some better failure mode by tagging it at build time.
The thing is, we need to do the same for the CRI. So that was a suggestion. I don't care.
Well, yeah, but so this ties into that though. Because if we do that, then we can totally change how some of the stuff works and have an avenue to at least know like which version was supposed to work. Because we have a problem right now, like where we just assume that certain paths are going to exist and that we're not going to break that. And then we realize, oh, well, having one CNI manifest wasn't good enough. We need like N CNI manifests, and detecting if the image was built before or after that isn't very good right now. So if we're just like, oh, we're going to grab the IPv6 manifest, then we'll just say it doesn't exist and we'll give the user some terrible error. I've been thinking about how to solve that. And yeah, CRI is what drove that, but not actually the CRI itself. I'm looking at eliminating the tar loading at runtime and having them already loaded. And so that will change boot up behavior. And ideally, we still don't need to break. We can support the old behavior, but we need to we need to be able to identify that like we switched behavior in this image, or we switched the expected behavior. And the CNI stuff is going to fall on that. The other concern that I've had for the CNI that I haven't figured out what to do with, so it looks like right now you just went with the default subnets for everything, which probably should be great. I agree with that, but I'm thinking about some more, and inevitably someone's going to start hacking on, configurable subnets, and now we need some kind of API for controlling CNI. Like people already today, like a couple of places that we didn't intend for these things to really be APIs, but like, oh, if you want to play with it, you can like use an extra mount to bind mount a CNI manifest, and then it will boot that instead, which works, but it's not really an API we thought about. And that stuff's not a huge deal, but it does mean that we can't, we don't know the actual intent of the user very well in the code. So it's really hard for us to migrate, because we're going to migrate some things. Like the biggest change that is definitely going to be breaking that I've been thinking about is if we switch the CRI and we stop doing tarball loading, that potentially breaks a bunch of people that are depending on like, oh, I can just drop this manifest here and these tars there, and boom, it does stuff. Or like, oh, I can just talk to Docker on the node, except Kubernetes isn't talking to Docker and Containerd has different storage. So I think to do this migration well, we probably need to introduce that mechanism to say like, I don't know, almost like an API version for the image or something like that. And I've been trying to think about how to do that well. One way is to go about just versions. Another way is to like tag sort of like maybe like a list of capabilities or something like that. Like this image is Containerd. This image is Calico multi-manifest, something like that. And then we could at the beginning of the cluster create process, we can like grab all that info and use it to select over how we handle booting the image. But I'm not sure which of those makes the most sense yet. I think the version number thing is simpler, but it's not as powerful, and it doesn't, and we're probably going to wind up going multi-dimensional anyhow. Like the CNI changes are different from the CRI changes.
Yeah, that's the tricky part.
On the other hand, if we do a simple version number, we can also just, that works pretty well for the path of like, okay, this is a V2 kind image. We don't support V1 images anymore, or something like that. I'm not a huge fan of that though, because there's not a lot of code so far to support old behavior, like how we used to just install leave. And that's a pretty small piece of code, but it means that like if you upgrade kind and you keep using your setup with the same command line, it still works, even with the older image. I would like to get people in the habit of just like installing the latest release. We periodically get, oh, this thing doesn't work, and it turns out we already patched it. And I don't think we have enough capacity to really handle like running old branches and like doing patch releases to old branches and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know. I think that you are right. If we are going to support all these metrics and all these things, it's better to go with an interface for the customers for all these things.
Yeah, and so for the CNI, I'm not sure. I feel like the problem with the CNI is that like CNI doesn't have a way to tell it things like the subnets. You just, every CNI has its own bespoke mechanism for this.
Well, the main problem with the CNI is the pod subnet. It's the only thing. That's the main problem. The pod subnet that is hard-coded in the cluster.
Mm-hmm.
If you move that, you can change. I think that or you can change. They seems to have something to configure. At least Calico is very flexible. I don't know.
Right.
some
But
sort.
so another thing that we have that people are doing off of this is like, oh, I want to use insert my favorite CNI here, or even testing the CNIs themselves. It would be nice if we could just do this with one mechanism, but so far it looks like the answer to this is basically like just text templating or something. And the problem with that is then people's templates depend on like which things you're going to supply them, and then that's a new area that we have to like not break. So similarly, if we do this internally, I'm concerned that like everyone will start getting at it. But I'm wondering if maybe we can just do it internally, not document it, and then people can use it, but it's understood that like we're going to change the template mechanism. I mean, it's not stable.
Are you guys like arguing whether we should hard code a seeder for the?
Yeah, so right now it just hard codes the seeders. But
Well, we have to do it if you want Calico, I'm pretty sure.
well, we could like template the Calico manifest or something.
You mean like move it outside of the kind code?
I mean, like when we're right before applying the manifest, we could substitute in the actual CIDR.
Mm-hmm.
Could
Well,
that? Oh, sorry.
Calico is more flexible. Also, you can label the Kubernetes with the nodes and the pods and everything.
We can also do environment variables. If you want.
Yeah, you don't have to use it to configure in the installation manifest. You can label. Well, I'm not an expert. I was dealing with Calico 1 or 2 days, but
Well, okay, let me rephrase that. So that works for Calico, but like when people go to use
yeah, Flannen or Whip or the other.
yeah, Cilium or something, then all of those, as far as I know, should be possible to pass through some kind of piece of the manifest. But then you just have to do templating.
Conceptually,
Go ahead, please.
conceptually, as like a cluster operator, I've always found that like installing a different CNI is, in most instances, for most modern ones, just kind of installing a manifest and maybe changing some flags on an API server or controller manager. I kind of, in a way, could kind of just provide a way to say like disable the default CNI that we do support, and provide a like almost here is in some maybe some cleverer way, but here is a load of YAML. Go and apply this at the point where you would normally install Weave. And then it's kind of like up to the cluster operator to make sure, up to the person running it to make sure that the pod CIDR is synced up between that template they provide and the kubeadm config. But at least initially that would unblock this discussion, and then templating and everything else could kind of come later. But at least then like you're encoding all that same data into the same file. And as it stands, changing the certain CIDRs does involve changing multiple fields anyway in the kubeadm config, so it's not that much of a departure.
Right. So would you expect I guess the next thing is kind of going to have a concept of the CIDR itself, not just the kubeadm config batches or something.
I don't understand why it would need to. It'd be good if we can avoid it.
Well, if you don't, you have to default to something, and if you default to something, there's a chance that it like clashes with actual private IP space.
I think, yeah, but I think that's kind of unrelated to this problem in a way. Like we've already got that problem today. If someone creates it, if they need to change it, they can, and if they're providing their own CNI config, at least initially, just having a way to, and it fits in quite nicely with the phases idea, because it's effectively a phase, and you're just saying, okay, just don't do what you'd normally do, and here's a load of YAML instead. And yeah, we're only exposing here's some YAML, but I think for a lot of users that's probably sufficient, given they can tweak things like controller manager and API server flags.
Right. I mean, so if we had an option to just like don't do the CNI phase, then we could tell you to like load the images and then apply your manifest.
Yeah, I think loading images. I mean, initially, I feel like we could probably even skip on that. Like you do.
Oh yeah, I mean you don't have to do that, but like if you're like hacking on your CNI or something, you probably like would probably the main use case for not using the default CNI. Because if you're some other user and you're like hacking on Kubernetes or something, you shouldn't be worried about which CNI we're deploying, just that it works.
Yeah.
So the way I see this is you can basically hard code a bunch of CNIs as an option, predefine their CIDRs, close a field in the kind config in networking, for instance, to default to a different value if you want, but also provide a phase that you can skip the default completely and allow the users to install their own. So there are multiple layers to the problem here.
Yeah, because I guess the biggest problem is that if we are installing I think the simplest answer is to just tell people if you want to change the CIDRs in the kubeadm config, you need to install the CNI yourself as well. And we'll come back to this problem later. Because otherwise we have to deal with the problem of syncing those up, and then now we need some mechanism to like correctly configure the CNI, and like that's a lot more complicated than the original problem.
I mean,
Yeah, so for Calico, a quick question. So isn't it sufficient for Calico to just pass the pod network CIDR and in the kubeadm config? I don't think we have to modify the Calico manifest themselves.
Yeah, you need to match the pool network with the pod subnet, otherwise it fails.
So it's, yeah, go ahead, James.
If kind remains kind of in its opinionated state right now, though, we could teach it how to do templating for, say, like whatever we choose to be the default that most users want. So say Weave now, Calico or whatever. I'm like punting that discussion. So basically, we teach kind how to handle the pod subnet by default if they don't specify their custom CNI config YAMLs. But if they do, then they handle it because we don't know how to deal with that.
Right, but in that case, we also probably want to make a like top level networking option specifically for this, which again I think can come after if we switch to Calico. It just seems worth going ahead and thinking about it now, because so far we've just totally ignored this problem, and we've been relying on the fact that Weave will sort of just try to sort itself out with a default, and I forget some other thing without syncing it up. Like we're not setting the pod CIDR anywhere currently. So it's already going to be a breaking change in some respect to actually start doing that, because then it should, I believe that also means that we're not masking the pod traffic right now, because Kubernetes can't tell what's pod traffic and what's not, because we just haven't set a CIDR for anything. And kubeadm doesn't set a default for pod CIDR.
I mean, it doesn't, because there's so many different plugins that depend on different values.
Right. But we're now looking at maybe doing a model where we do just set one.
So are you guys thinking about switching to Calico as the default because of IPv6?
Right, yes.
And maybe we should hard code the CIDR in the kubeadm config template.
Yeah. But so a couple of people have piggybacked off on this and that's what this PR has wound up turning into for customizing the CNI. I think maybe we should go in a different direction and continue to say it's possible to override it. Maybe we'll add the phase option for that. And instead we should just put all the manifests we need into the image and not expose any options for like building with a different one natively.
Yeah, I think we should pretty much default to CIDR and to manifests and images for Calico. And if they want a custom CNI with custom CIDRs and stuff in images, we can expose it as a phase eventually.
Yeah, and phase is definitely something that we want to land this cycle anyhow, for other reasons.
Yeah, just it makes sense to me. If they want this level of customization, they should use the phases. I mean, that's how we handle problems like that in Cubadium.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, I like that. So let's do phases. And Antonio, can we do something like maybe just like one manifest per IP family or something?
Yeah, I have done that. So then that pull request. So I have in that pull request I have each manifest with IP protocol and each what is the name and each CNI plugin.
Yeah, so then we could, and then we also only need to do Calico.
Yeah, well, it's the work is done and is tested. It's just a matter that once we have the phases to integrate on that.
Or right, but I mean, right now we have the. Right now you have to select the manifest at build time. It uses the same images though, right? So we should be able to put all of the Calico manifests, just at like 3 locations.
Okay, in one name. Okay, I got it. Okay, yeah, it's simple. Don't worry.
Then you can then with any image you can pick any IP family and it will just select the correct matching manifest at runtime.
Okay.
I think that will be more convenient, and that way you don't need to like build a new base image every time you want to tweak this. I mean, we could even write these at node image time. I think would probably be another good option. Because so the other thing that's going to change is the tarball saving. I meant to put that up today. That I'm actually looking at doing that at build time as well, so that we can make the loading faster, but that will break some of this. It should be more reliable that way as well. So with containerd, which I guess is the next topic in here, with containerd, we have this really nice thing where the snapshot storage is very cleanly laid out and identified and separate. And we have a good default that we should be able to run everywhere in overlay, I believe. With that option, what we can do is for new images that are built to run with, that would be built to run with containerd, we'd have the option to load all of the images into the snapshot storage at build time, and then shut down containerd and persist just the snapshot storage, which is a well-known location and not anything else. And then at runtime, we don't need to load the images at all. Instead, you just start containerd. We don't even need to watch for containerd to start. And we can move on to running Cubadium, and the images will just already be loaded because we already have the snapshot storage in the image. If you do that, then we avoid a lot of copying around these big Kubernetes image tarballs, and that's a kind of a major blocker to the boot speed right now, particularly on worse hardware. The downside is you do have to say that it's going to run with this runtime is another thing, because they have different storage, all the CNRs. So you amortize this at build time, and for many nodes as well, you also now don't have to run this step across all the nodes. You ran it when you created the image. And I looked into it, and this is actually how some of the more advanced VM image baking is done as well. It's just more efficient, but it will require that we be a little bit more clever handling older versus newer images, and it would not enable, I believe, Lumire's suggestion of configuring which one. I'm not sure that we need to. It seems like using Docker shim is kind of on the way out. It's not really being, it technically works, but no one is taking up actively maintaining it. and production deployments seem to have moved towards CRI.
I mean, how with this transition to snapshots, would the users still be able to load any image in a container they want?
Yes, but they would need to do so. Some kind of hack where you did something like mount the tarball or something. We'd probably stop doing that. Instead, you would use like kind load image. That should still function. The idea is that the load step that we run ourselves, we should be able to pre-do that.
Yes, it's the slowest part right now. Like copying.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you probably have to evaluate like if something else can emerge as a problem because of that, because of the.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying that for sure we move to this yet. I'm still working on that. But I kind of stopped working on it for a bit to think about the problem with the images, and also like if we're okay being opinionated enough to switch to this. Because the other thing is that means that like we will actually switch from Dockerd to Containerd, and we might even like want to switch to where we don't even run Dockerd. And it should be lighter and hopefully more stable as well. But it's also been much easier to debug so far. But then we may have similar questions in the future around like cryo. Like for example, I'm not sure if cryo supports that kind of behavior, but I guess we can cross that path when we get there. I'm not sure that we even really want to own that well, being super configurable on every axis. And I think a couple of these things like CRI are mostly better tested on like real clusters where you aren't sharing a kernel. But yes, I mean we'd also be depending on controlling the config a bit more. So we'll need to provide users with a couple high-level options over this for like, I want these insecure registries to be enabled so that they stop bind mounting the config for like Docker D. Because we'll need to control some options like which snapshotter is used. Otherwise, the images won't be there, because that is the other thing. They're loaded into a particular snapshotter. So if you're like, I'm going to use BetterFS snapshotting, don't, it's not going to work. But it also won't have the images loaded into it.
I mean, after DIMS SPR, it's only the native snapshot that works.
Yeah, but that I'm going to change that. So that is actually related to a different problem. The problem on that one is that the snapshotter needs to not be on another snapshotter. And right now, the images is only built with varlib Docker as a volume. If we do varlib or we do varlib containerd, that problem goes away and we can use whichever snapshot we choose. And the default overlay is probably the one we want to use, and I believe is just in the kernel. So if people are running at least like a 4.0 kernel, hopefully, it should be available everywhere. It's not like a module they need to load or anything like that.
I mean, it's Containerd. It's really the right choice to start moving towards. I don't know. Like you said, we're probably a bit opinionated to move that early. Without Docker regime is still there, but yeah, it's probably your decision. Like,
I mean, we also can support multiple. My concern is that we keep finding that people depend on these details. So I think it's better to break it sooner. Because people reach around and they do things like, I'm going to Docker login on the node. And I've even had to help a few people with this because it has unblocked actual work, but then it means that they're depending on like, oh, I can Docker login on the node, and that's going to be associated with Kubernetes. I think a bunch of these things like CNI and CRI that are supposed to be auxiliary are like very, like, you can't hide that. There's no way to make that a non-leaky abstraction, the fact that you're using a certain CRI or a certain CNI. People are going to use the features of those as well.
Yeah, I just want to remind that, so when we, the survey we did for KubeADM, we got something like 70% Docker users, 15% cryo 15% container D.
Right. So
yeah.
the other hope that DIMS have had is that so in this case we're not even installing containerd, we're just installing a more recent Docker, and Docker ships all of that, and they're moving towards a world where these will be using the same storage and everything, in which case even if you're saying, oh, I just installed Docker and I installed Kubernetes, we can say, use the CRI path.
So what's supporting the multiple options, like the multiple options to preload,
So we can. There's a couple drawbacks. One is either we need to build multiple different images with different ways of preloading and maintain that, and then you're going to need to select an image that matches the runtime you want, even though in theory they could both be installed. Or we're going to need to significantly bloat the image by preloading into both.
Yeah. So with automation coming in terms of building the node image, technically it's not going to be that much of a burden to maintain a couple of.
I don't know if that's coming. The other thing is that just like it's kind of bad as an end user UX to like say, oh, this config option only works with this image. And then we need to start like tagging different branches. I think it's something we could do in the future. I'm not sure if there's actually enough demand. Like for the things that you can reasonably do with kind, it shouldn't matter that much which one. The main reason it matters to people right now is because they need to set some additional options. And most of those, I think they'd be happy with a higher level one. Like insecure registries or something, for example, that kind can configure itself, or the proxy metadata. And that's also easier to implement and maintain if we just target something.
Please go ahead, sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking, could we say like we distribute the standard default image, which is what we'd call like a multi-arch sort of image, where like that might not be the most efficient way of loading images, but it is more flexible because it can load into different runtimes. I guess I maybe I'm misunderstanding, but can all of the runtimes read in like one of the .tar files we currently ship?
They can, but it's one of the most expensive steps currently. It's part of why booting is as slow as it is. And it's not quite that bad on big, fast hardware, but like in your Travis CI setup or something, that is one of the most slow, painful steps. We can hopefully see, we need to measure more, improve the experience quite a bit by not needing that for the default. By having it already loaded into the correct format on disk, because the tarball format is actually an archival format. It just everything in the tarball has to be copied into a different format before it can actually be used in every runtime.
So how much is the bloat of the snapshot versus the Docker preloading?
So that's a interesting problem. Depending on how you look at it, it's less. It should be larger, but it's also going to compress again. And either way, when you boot, you're going like that's the first thing we do is expand to that, and then you have both. So at runtime, it's going to be lower. At download time, it has the potential to be worse. It depends on how well it actually compresses with Docker Hub and so on. And you can't really test that without actually pushing an image.
Maybe we should test this.
Yeah. So I would like to, but I wanted to discuss it a bit first. And I also wanted to look at the how we tag the image with the info thing. I do think we could just do the tarball thing and continue to eat the cost, but on the other hand, I think for most people, this stuff shouldn't matter that much, but the cost does. I mean, for example, for the Kubernetes project, if we're going to run multi-node clusters, it's going to be better, faster, and cheaper for us if we can load up front and then just boot in nodes with this.
With the pile of kubeadm tests we want to add, definitely it's going to be less expensive in the, pro cost.
Right, because we're also like basically always doing multi-node for our own tests. And then for users that are just doing like, I boot a node and I test a Kubernetes app on top, most of the stuff shouldn't really matter. The thing that matters is how quickly they can get a local cluster up. I feel like it's going to be another one of those things, kind of like CNI, where like somebody somewhere wants this, but not very many people. And I don't know that we need to block on that. I'd still like to someday say like, sure, you can run literally any CRI, but I imagine a few like Kata are not really going to work in our environment anyhow. And when I'm looking at like which of those will integrate well, I think Containerd is going to work the best for our use case. And I think we can show with what DIMS's work that it should be a reasonable migration path. I think talking to Signode and looking at everything there, Docker Shim is on a fast track to going out, just because while plenty of end users are using it now, that's just because they use defaults. And as far as like maintainership is going, Docker is also not really expressing all that much interest in working on Docker Shim, and instead they're working on getting to a world where Docker is built on top of Containerd actually. Right now, I think it's built on it, but it's like in process or something like that. They're trying to move to a world where like it actually runs as a separate process and it communicates the same as like Kubernetes would.
There's always the option that we can wait until transition in Kubernetes starts happening.
So we can, but we have a good opportunity to do some of the things like the image preloading right now.
Yeah, but it has immediate benefits.
Yeah, and things like the debuggability, because they're not bound by, how Docker has been. A number of things have been redesigned and are much, much easier to understand and work with. Like the snapshotting on disk, you can poke around with that on disk and very easily understand what's going on. It's a lot less opaque, and everything is actually like pluggable and documented, configurable, and that sort of thing.
So there's also this patch requires replacing all the commands. It requires to replace all the commands we do, like everywhere, Docker exec, stuff like that?
Not really, because almost all those are on the host. We don't actually interact with the node runtime very much. We do it for image loading. We do it to configure the proxy details.
Yeah. For HA proxy, I think we exec.
That we do. That one we just do a run though. That one's interesting.
I actually wanted to bring this as a topic because I was behind a corporate proxy today, or rather, and I found out that we still pull the image for HA proxy from the internet, and I was bored. And
everything about the HA setup is brittle and relatively untested right now. We're not really leveraging this yet. Pretty recently it had some actual major bugs in it. I'm sure there's more. That one will be harder, but that one's still a pretty solvable problem. That will actually be the most annoying thing to do, because we would need to actually like run a container ourselves or something. But it shouldn't be a blocker. And yeah, preloading that is probably something we want to start doing.
Yeah. I just realized that we download the image.
Yeah, there's some other similar stuff like Melian was looking at, or Duffy was looking at, like configuring himself or something, and the fact that we use HA proxy is also not necessarily something I want to commit to yet. There are a lot of reverse proxies that they all have interesting features, and we're kind of using it in the simplest mode. We're not really doing anything advanced with it.
It's just a small image and pretty easy to set up, quick config.
Right.
Are you like looking for something like ingress?
Well, so there's us doing other networking things like ingress, and there's also things like there are other good reverse proxies that we might look at. Like, I mean, we could just as well be using another CNCF project like Envoy instead.
Yeah, it makes sense. Promoting it as a default also means that we are going to test it for them.
Right. So I'm not jumping to mess with that yet, but I also like to avoid saying that like it's always going to be HA proxy or anything like that. But we should preload it. That is an oversight.
I think I can send a patch for that tomorrow, right?
Yeah, I'm also looking at just in general revamping the image build. Another thing I've been looking at and considering is eliminating the Docker commit stuff we do in favor of some build. Since we're not actually doing package installs for the most part anymore, we could potentially break it into some actual normal Docker build type stuff, and that has an upside that cross compilation becomes a lot more viable if we like pre-build the base image for various architectures. Then we just need to build the binaries for those architectures, which we can already do cross compiling, and then just like copy them in. And that's really close to what the install actually does today. The steps where we're running something outside of the base image are pretty superfluous now, except the apt install. But the apt install method is not very good today.
Did DIMS get the ARM stuff going, running somewhere?
Sort of. We don't have continuous CI or anything like that, but it somewhat works now.
Mm-hmm. Is the idea to like pull the latest Kubernetes, test this periodically, and send the signal to test it, something like that?
Yeah. So also, what I'd like to do eventually with that is get the build from Tarball stuff working and combine that with a mode where we don't actually need to run the container to build, and then it should become pretty cheap to even do like cross-built images, and eventually we could even do like publish manifest list images or something like that.
Yeah,
but
so
like just steps towards that, not rushing into that.
mm-hmm. In Kinder, Fabrizio, what he did is he put the idea about downloading the Tarbals.
Mm-hmm.
He took it to another level where you can basically specify a different version for kubeadm, for instance, because it's for the sig-test.
Mm-hmm.
He is basically not using the upstream patch, but he's doing something else.
So there's something else we need to do there that is pretty big. Right now we generate a single kubeadm config cluster-wide. That's the other major breaking thing that I think we should fix. Instead, we probably want to bring back per node patches, and we want to actually generate the file on every node instead of copying it from them. And with every node, we should respect the Kubernetes version. And then you can also do a form of skew testing where you set one node to one image and one node to another image, and we generate the appropriate config for each.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense in terms of the flexibility of the cluster. Yeah.
And then we can actually do some Kubernetes component skew testing, which would be pretty nice. Today, that's not going to work very well.
Yeah, so to be honest, kubeadm does not support skewing the API server compared to the control manager, for instance. You have to hack it around. It's not possible for kubeadm.
It doesn't support skewing what?
The controller manager versus the API server having different patch versions, for instance.
Well, I mean, so that's not something that would happen with this, right? Those are both going to run on the control plane.
Yes, basically, we treat the control plane components as a whole, as the same version.
Right. At some point, if we're going to have upgrade, we probably need to handle that.
Yeah,
But that's a separate problem. We can say like, all control planes have to be the same version or something like that. But you should be able to skew the workers.
yeah, definitely.
And right now, the only reason you can't necessarily do that is because we're going to try to use the same config file everywhere, and we may have like a different Kubernetes API version.
So you can also implement a mechanic for patch references. The way this works is like, imagine at the bottom of the config, you can place the 3 dashes, and you can have a patch that is reused multiple nodes. But you have another that is only specific to one of them. And with references, you can do this, but it requires parsing the YAML in a way that it supports multiple documents, in the same. But this is very clean. I like it.
You could also get away with this today using YAML anchors.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we should start by in V1 Alpha 3 just adding per node patches as an option. It will be a little bit unwieldy, but it won't be a breaking change other than the fact that we're going to start generating the file on each node. And then like for V1 Alpha 4, it might be a good idea to use references instead.
I mean, I have seen anchors, but I don't even know how to properly do it.
I don't like anchors. In this case, they probably would be pretty reasonable. Anchors pretty much just let you reference another snippet of YAML, and it drops in at the current level of nesting.
I see.
Which makes them a little bit harder to understand than patches, because when you're looking at the piece that's being anchored, you don't know what the context it's going into is. You have to look in both places to understand it.
Patches are already kind of confusing to users.
Yeah. They're a little bit more understandable because you can at least see that, like, this field is being set in this level of the struct when you look at a patch. With YAML anchors, when you're looking at the piece that's going to be anchored, you have no idea where it's supposed to go. You can't tell. It's not possible. You have to find all the references to it. But it is something that is natively supported today.
Yeah, that's the good part about it. Yeah. You can also, for the next alpha, you can just support the full patch in every node. That's like the easiest option.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I haven't figured out is the patches have had such an underspecified API currently. By that I mean like what it's going to actually do to the cluster. The fact that they wound up being cluster-wide was a bit weird, especially V1 Alpha 2, where you put patches on a node, but they actually got applied to the cluster-wide config. And then we started only respecting the first control plane nodes patches and not reading in any of the other patches, which was also strange. I'd like to fix that behavior, but it's not clear how much of that's a breaking change or if we even care, since this is an alpha type and that never behaved well to begin with.
I mean, I don't think we should care that much about the config. It was the V1 Alpha 1, right?
V1 Alpha 2 also did this. Alpha 3 is a little bit better, but part of that is that we just don't have node level patching.
Yeah, I understood. So I think this is like we can dodge the bullet with an action requirement.
Or what I mean is not actually the adding per node patches, the generating a config file on every node is also technically a breaking change.
Yeah, but there has to be a default, there has to be a single source of truth.
Right, well, yes, I mean, you're just generating it on the same way, but the one part that's going to change per node is the node's information, the fact that, like, okay, this is a Kubernetes V1X1. But again, right now, that's just something that, like, if you have a config right now that sets images from different Kubernetes versions, it probably just doesn't even work. I don't think anyone has this. So if we break that behavior, I don't think it's a real concern. And we are alpha.
Yeah,
On the other hand, I've tried to avoid breaking changes in the API. So V1 Alpha 2 also, to this day, when it's converted, retains its behaviors as we've improved the defaults. And if you switch to V1 Alpha 3, then you get the better defaults.
Yeah, so the conversion from version 2 to version 3 is going to break the users a little. It's unavoidable, but I think we should do it. I think we should make the change possible.
Yeah, and so then once we do that, we can add per node patches, and they will behave like you would actually expect. Whereas today, they don't behave like you'd expect at all if we were to add them, because it's all going to wind up in one file. It just gets copied to the nodes anyhow.
Yeah, probably the patch references are something to consider with this as part of this change.
Right.
I think because otherwise you have to add it like the patches to every node, and the user has to copy it multiple times.
Right, but so what I'm also expecting with this is that probably people don't actually need to patch that often unless you're really like kind of tweaking kind or something. Like it's already a very power user feature, but what will change is the fact that the base generated file is going to become better.
Yeah. They might server and patch everything.
And I will punt this till the next time since we're low, but I think we might need to consider having some other cluster-wide options for that we use for our own generation without actually templating or anything, just saying that, like, you know, if you set this verbosity field, then in the base config file, we're going to go through to every component and set that verbosity level or something like that. Because a few of those things are a bit overly painful today. Feature gates are another one. So that gets kind of weird. That gets in the territory of, like, I don't know, maybe we're trying to make Kubernetes config more usable or something like that. But it is still a real problem. And if I'm a user of Kind, I probably don't even really want to touch the configs that much, but I do want to do something like I need feature gates on to test. And it might be worth making a higher level option for that.
I mean, we haven't gotten demands for that in KubeADM in general. Like nobody said, "Hey, enable me a feature gate that I'm going to apply to the whole cluster."
Right, but we have been seeing people that are testing that, like for KubeUp, it's an extremely common thing to turn on feature gates, so that we can test like alpha APIs and things. And ideally, we want to do less of that. KubeUp, that is.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a field under the kind config, like a global features, something like that. Yeah, for the verbosity, the gates.
Mm-hmm. So I've been trying to think about like which of those would make sense, and if it even makes sense at all, because I mean, it is possible to do this with Kubernetes config and with the patches today. It's just ideally for common use cases, you shouldn't need to touch the patches. They're more of a like, we haven't implemented an option for this yet. If you want to try, you can use this to try stuff. They're also useful for developing Kind. But I think if users are having, if common use cases are having to depend on the patches, we're probably failing.
Yeah, I can think of different stuff like playing with the certs in some way. They have to provide custom folders. You know,
right. But so that I think is probably not a common enough thing. That's like I'm hacking on Kubernetes or something. If you're hacking on Kubernetes, I expect you to use the Kubernetes config. But if you're hacking on Kubernetes or testing something on top of it, ideally you shouldn't need to. I mean, we're already generating it for you.
I mean, users can always find a reason to modify, to apply patches to the nodes. They can always find a reason.
Right. So I don't think we need to get rid of the patches, but I do think that if there's some like extremely common thing like turning on features, we should consider giving you an option that doesn't involve writing a patch file for all your nodes or something.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Yes, definitely.
The other upside of that is that that kind of feature is cross Kubernetes version, whereas the patches you need to target the correct Kubernetes API version yet because we haven't hit V1.
Mm-hmm. I'm not a fan of feature gates in general. I think they're kind of broken mechanic.
That's fair, but they are right now. If you're developing a Kubernetes feature, you have to go this route, and since we want people to test Kubernetes.
Yes. So, quick question: Do you plan like a new minor release anytime soon?
I think we need to adjust the date, but we set it to be monthly ish. And last meeting we picked some things to try to get into it. Phases, local dynamic volumes, tarball building, looking at traffic serving, looking at containerd, and finishing the host level container shim and node restart. I think node restart is probably punted at this point because of the issues with the IP. But we could do some other things to make that more viable going forward. And the host abstraction I haven't gotten on yet, but I'm realizing that we need this anyhow for like testing. Right now, there's a whole bunch of random code that reaches out and like calls Docker and that sort of thing, and that all goes down to executing things on the host, and that's nearly impossible to even think about testing properly, short of just like we boot a cluster and see if it works. So I'm somewhere down in the pile of all these things. Ideally, for the next release, I'd like to get to a point where most of that is behind some kind of self-defined interface. It's not exactly CRI, because we also do build and stuff, so that we can inject that and we can inject a mock.
Yeah.
And as a side benefit, we can add Podman.
Yeah. So what I started like doing in KubeADM, like, convincing people that the right thing to do is every cycle of KubeADM, I try to define the items we can tackle, and we don't add stuff that we cannot handle. What is the most important, and kick everything out to the next cycle, basically.
Yeah, I think what has been important has shifted around on me a bit. I think continually I'm trying to find the things that are reasonable enough to do that are going to unblock the most usage, and occasionally go through and do things like we should add our interface thing just so that our own maintainability stays reasonable. And I'm realizing there's some pretty significant upsides to the CRI shifting around. Originally that was lower prioritized, but the experiments with the preloading and things are fairly promising. And I've also been realizing that like when you're not running on my nice big Linux workstation, these things are slower, and there are some useful environments where it's slower. So I'd like to start profiling that more and fixing that, because I think kind is a little bit unnecessarily bloated right now. The images are pretty large, and the boot time is slower than it needs to be. And
Yeah.
I think that's blocking a lot of like we could test. I mean, we want to be able to test very cheaply, so we can test more things.
Yeah, we also started working on config map walks. This means that we can hopefully one day boot the control planes in parallel.
Yeah, I've been following that. That's good to see.
Yeah, one quick question is kind of unrelated to kind. Do you know what happened to pull Kubernetes end-to-end GCE? Like, did we manage to reduce the times?
We reduced it some. We also increased the limit to as high as the scalability tests, which are too slow. I think it's around 60 minutes right now, but like as soon as we add anything, it's going to get longer. We'll see. They're also adding a storage pre-submit that only runs in some cases that will have some of the slow storage tests.
Because I saw Michelle send a PR that moved like 5 tests to slow, and I look at the times and it didn't change anything. Like it was 60 minutes before, and now it's like 60 minutes again. So I got really confused why this is happening like that. But anyway, that's a separate topic,
Yeah, I'm also not particularly active on that front right now. Trying to keep up with Kind and everything else has been a bit much, and with some other frustrating things going on and whatnot, I've stepped back from testing for a little bit for the moment, and I'm mostly up to date on that because Catherine finally stepped in to fix it, and Catherine sits across from me, so I'm sort of up to date by like osmosis, but I'm not like actively tackling that right now.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask if you have any updates. It's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Sorry that was such a meandering discussion. I did not have time to actually put together any kind of agenda. We'll try to continue to improve the organization of this project. And Antonio, I'll try to put more time into looking at the IPv6 stuff. I think we should look towards the multi-manifest thing, and I will today look at how we can start marking the images with information about what they support.
No rush. I don't have.
I don't like seeing it. I don't like seeing a PR sit for that long. It's a lot of work, and I appreciate it. So
yeah, well, don't worry.
Thanks. Well, we're 3 minutes over time. Happy Monday, everyone. I gotta run to my next meeting.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.